Welcome to Policy Unpacked. I am here with my favorite professor, Ms. Maya Tudor, Professor of Politics and Public Policy at the Blavatnik School of Government. And we are here to discuss about something that is gaining a lot of momentum, which is nationalism. Welcome, Maya.
Thanks for having me, Aathma.
Yes. From India to US to Hungary, we see that a lot of people are questioning about who belongs, who does not belong, what it means to be a part of the nation. So my first question to you is that why is it gaining momentum right now? Why is nationalism gaining momentum right now?
Well, so nationalism, first of all, is this really interesting identity, right? Because it's an imagined identity. We all know that we don't go very far back in history, and for most nations, they don't exist. So they're new, relatively speaking, in human history. And they're imagined because even if you come from the smallest nation, you are probably not going to meet most of your compatriots, most of your fellow citizens. So, but you somehow imagine that you belong to this community. And the question is, what are the markers of that belonging? And they're different by place and by time, but it's this community of belonging. So it's rising now for a couple of reasons, one of which is because there's a great degree of economic security in contemporary times. That's partly because globalization, which is a rising tide that lifts all boats, so to speak, has also really negatively affected particular groups. And the kind of economic churn caused by globalization, and now that it's being supercharged by AI, that's one basket of reasons I think we're seeing people turn to identity. It helps them make sense of, how do I make sense of all this change? And a sense of who am I is a place that we all go to in times of insecurity in our lives. Who am I? How do I make sense of this changing world? Is a very important place for most people. It's also true, though, that we're seeing not just economic change, but we're seeing a lot of cultural change. That's partly through immigration. It's partly through intermarriage between social groups, caste groups in India, different racial groups. And we're seeing even some of the basic categories that have traditionally structured society, like gender, are being challenged and reframed. And that's a lot of churn. And in that environment, the sense that I belong to a community, this imagined community of we the people, and that has continuous meaning to me, that's, I think, very, very important. Now, it should be said that in this environment of kind of real churn in culture and in economics and status loss that sometimes comes with that, you have political entrepreneurs, so politicians or would-be politicians who come along and say, we are a great people and this is who we have always been. And that's appealing to people because it's something that's not changing.
That was very insightful, Maya. This takes me back to our classroom in Nationalism and Democracy class where we read Arlie Hochschild's Strangers in Their Own Land, where she looks at the ethnography of a working-class white Trump voter. She argues that these Trump voters feel like they've been waiting in line patiently for the American dream, but then constantly feel like they're being cut in front of by immigrants, like you mentioned, or women, or other minority groups. And this leaves them feeling very resentful and unrecognized and hence a stranger in their own land. I want to understand about what she is getting right in this book that a lot of political scientists kind of do not think about or understand about, and that's going towards nationalism.
Yeah. So what Arlie Hochschild really gets right, in my mind, is that politics is not just about material interests. And especially in a political science discipline that's heavily dominated by economistic thinking, who gets what is often the most important way of understanding politics. And politics is not just about who gets what, it's also about feeling seen and heard and recognition and identity. And so what Arlie Hochschild gets right is understanding that just because you're going to benefit from a policy doesn't mean you're going to vote for the person who's propounding that policy if they are not making you feel seen and heard. And that politics will need to take that more seriously. So, she's also empathetic in really important ways to the really difficult plight that many people are in white working class communities who have been left behind by globalization. And that's really another reason that I didn't mention in answer to your first question, why nationalism is rising. The well-to-do elite in every society is more global today than it has been in generations past. Airplane travel is easier than it was 3 or 4 generations ago. People are studying abroad and moving from country if you're a member of the elite. But it's only 4% of the world's population that lives outside of the country of their birth. So as a global elite pull away from being taxed in their country of residence, from studying in their country of residence, there's a sense by a more ordinary person who doesn't have these opportunities that they are not of us anymore. And so nationalism is maybe a little bit of an identity that many people can cling to when they feel like elites are leaving them behind. And in this case, Arlie Hochschild is really great at recognizing the way in which those interact.
But why not cling to something like having labor unions or just fighting for better regulations and laws? But why nationalism? Is it because it's instant and ready to be given by some powerful authority or a political entrepreneur? Because I would like to also believe that a common man is smarter and a smart voter. So I'm unsure about why and where this is coming from.
So we're spending a lot of time talking about the US, and this is not just a phenomenon that is particular to the US. I'll answer your question about the US, but then let's also, when you look out, this is not just something that is particular to, let's say, a Trump voter in the United States. So this is not, politicians are providing the narratives, right, of who is to blame, what is the story of your plight, and who do you blame? And this is partly about political entrepreneurs coming out and saying, well, the reason for your troubles, or I first of all see your troubles. Yeah. And Trump, especially in his first presidency, his first term, really recognized, for example, the opioid epidemic. And that was something that the Democratic Party hadn't seen. The Democratic Party went on board, as did the Labour Party in the UK, with unions declining. And with it went a very important organizational base for the Democratic Party. And so it is the case in many cases that the Democratic Party has lost touch with what everyday voter concerns are. The same thing could be said of the Congress Party in India, which had an extraordinary grassroots base in the run-up to national independence and afterwards. I mean, extraordinary compared to anything but the communist parties that were being constructed at the time. So in a relative sense, very well organized at a grassroots base. And that changed in the 1970s when the emergency happened and the party essentially cut off the grassroots infrastructure for particular historical reasons. So in answer to your question, the turn to a kind of particular form of nativist nationalism is that it offers a story of, I see you and I tell you who to blame.
That is very interesting. I've never quite put it in that exact line, which is very helpful for me and the viewers. So then let's discuss a bit more about India. You said that the Indian National Congress cut their connection with the grassroots levels in the 1970s. But it's another 40 years later that the BJP or the Bharatiya Janata Party comes in and says that be a Hindu in your own country and uses Hindu nationalist identity to then win elections. One of the reasons being that. But I want to understand exactly what was that gap other than grassroots level, cutting off grassroots level connections that the BJP kind of used to win the election.
So the story of belonging in any country, the nation, the we, the people, is a story that is created and it has to be always renewed and recreated. And I actually just want to start by saying that I think that's an incredibly hopeful phenomenon, because there's a tendency to think about nationalism as kind of good or bad, and mostly bad. But just stepping back, for most of human history, most people lived in absolutely small groups of 100 to 150 where they knew everyone face to face. And that now we as human beings cooperate with millions, in some countries like India, billion plus people. And the fact that this cooperation happens is a fragile miracle. You trust to some degree and cooperate with people who you have never met. That I think is actually a very hopeful basis for politics in a lot of ways. But India's founding nationalism, to get to your question, in the form of that was defined by the Indian National Congress, was one which was equidistant to religion. And there was a political entrepreneur who had, by the way, an incredibly well-organized base. So this comes back to the kind of structural factor. So unions disappeared in the United States and in the United Kingdom and other kind of post-industrial countries. But in India, it was that Congress, the left party's base atrophied in terms of organization. But at the same time, the BJP had an organization that really has an extraordinary social base, very well organized, even more strongly organized, I would say, than Congress at its founding. And that deep organizational base was fashioned through the fires as being outlawed several times. And so that infrastructure has been a very important part of targeting and understanding what narratives will work with people. So, the BJP has been able to appeal to, I think, the average Indian voter through a combination of appeals. Part of it is about Hindu nationalism. But I would argue that it's a pretty small proportion of people who are voting primarily for Hindu nationalism. They were voting for Modi, the person who got things done in his state of Gujarat. I mean, the first election, famously, people on the campaign trail said, who were interviewing people who were going to vote in that election, and they would joke, oh, if there's a toilet that's broken, Modi will fix it, right? So he was known as somebody who got things done. And people voted, I would say, more for that than they voted for this kind of Hindu nationalism per se. But there are groups who did vote for this Hindu nationalism. And, so it's all, politics is always about cobbling together these coalitions.
So, because you said that, of course, nationalism gets a bad reputation and that nationalism can be, of course, used to build state capacity and betterment of democracy. Is that really the exclusion or the rule? Because of course, like in India, like I understand that, but like in the US or the Hungary, nationalism, I guess, is at least as we speak. India 2014 is a different situation than India today. So 2014, there must have been so much more pushing out of Hindu nationalism than what we're seeing today. But so what is the rule and what is the exception?
Yeah, it's a great question. So most nations are created in the 20th century as decolonization is sweeping throughout most of the world. And in that, political entrepreneurs who define the nation, they often do absorb religion or race or other forms of identity, of kind of fixed identities, because it's easy. You know, if you say, as they do in Malaysia, to be Malay means to be ethnically Malay and it means to speak Malay, then that's your job is much easier as a politician. You go out and you appropriate the symbols of that identity and you make them the symbols of the nation. So it's an easy job. And that's why you're right to say that many more countries are built on kind of more fixed or more ethnic or nativist kinds of nationalism. But not all nationalism is like that. And not just India. Indonesia is another example of a country a huge country that is able to create a narrative of belonging that doesn't take one race or one religion and make it at the center of belonging. And you also have cases like Canada of countries that have adapted their nationalisms in a more inclusive direction, often under circumstances of threat, when politicians are really motivated to do so. But almost all nations, for example, didn't start with women being a part of the definition of the we the people in terms of citizenship. And almost all of them, right, all of them now have moved to that. So the capacity of nationalism as a story of belonging is that it can be reimagined, it can be refashioned. In fact, it always has been. And the challenge for political entrepreneurs is to fashion one that is thick but inclusive. And that's where the challenge lies. Because it's harder to thicken a fully kind of fictional basis for belonging that doesn't absorb those symbols and slogans from other fixed identities. But it's possible. There are 3 countries I've mentioned that have done that. And, you know, I think it's worth speaking for a moment about the Canada example, because Canada is a country that kind of had tacitly understood Canadianness to be defined by whiteness, 50 years ago. And then under Pierre Trudeau, there was this sense that because of the threat posed by Quebecois separatism, they needed to make French Canadianness consistent with Canadianness generally. So Trudeau said, great, you are French Canadian and you are Native Canadian and you are Indian Canadian. So it sort of stacked Canadian identity, and it made the other identities that we all have, whether it's gender or race or language, and it made them consistent with, rather than in tension with, the national identity. So the question that you're posing isn't inclusive nationalism the exception rather than the rule, is, I think, an important one. And I wouldn't say it's the exception. I think it's less common because it's a more demanding project for political entrepreneurs and politicians. And it's not instant, and it requires work. And that is the work, I think, of politicians, to go out and make inclusive narratives of belonging thick.
Is there any other example other than Canada? Because Canada is an advanced West democracy, but for the most of the world, that's not the case, which is just now facing this nationalism problem. So is there any other example that we can learn from?
Well, South Africa is an interesting example, right? So South Africa's national identity was defined by whiteness and a white hierarchy. And through the African National Congress and the process of reconciliation between racial categories, that is no longer true today. And this has been a struggle for South Africa, but it hasn't been as much of a struggle as you would expect. But it's every nation when you think about gender. And every nation has taken women into the fullness of citizenship. And that's unnoticed. But, that's
It's
a
taken for granted.
large part of the
Yeah.
population. So the expansion of belonging while still making it a thick sense of and a particular sense of, what does it mean to be Indian, right? To have that be particular and well understood by everybody in the country, but also to not have it be based on religion or exclusive categories of belonging, that's the challenge that politicians have to take up.
I just, of course, I agree with everything that you're saying, but when the feeling of recognized is very manufactured by social media, by the powerful with the network and the money, that it's impossible for a political entrepreneur with the right goals and the right um, things that he wants for the country to kind of do it at that pace. So then you are obviously either, you have two decisions to make. Either you do what the others are doing, or you hopefully go out of the fight. What else can that person do who has this, wants to build this, but has this enormous problem of social media?
So social media is really interesting because it's, in the one hand, it's really democratized the ability of people to participate in politics. If you think back 30, 40 years ago, you lived in a media environment in which elites and politicians were creating content that was disseminated to the people. That was really a very small group of people who sort of gate kept what we were reading and listening to and watching. That is completely democratized. Anybody with a smartphone is a content creator. But that also creates new challenges for politicians. And I've just written an article that's coming out actually in the journal Democracy on the way that politicians need to understand the new media environment. And one of the ways in which they need to understand it is that social media is not just a space for getting content out, but in a completely fragmented environment. So if the media world of 40 years ago was a public square in which people were having sort of the same conversations, more or less. Now, the media space is like a skyscraper with many thousands of rooms and people who are having lots of different conversations, and they're not necessarily talking to each other. And so the challenge is to find those rooms and to go into all of those rooms and to target people with messages that resonate. So politicians need to understand that. And in India, the BJP understands this better than any political party I have ever seen or read about. In the last election, the 2024 Indian election, I just looked at data which showed that the BJP micro-targeted 96% of its ads out there. So that is to say, it was really targeting to a very, very small group of people that it was reaching. That was compared to 32% of the opposition. That's why the BJP is partly so successful, because it has the organizational infrastructure to reach people. So the challenge is reaching people where they are, and they are no longer going to 3 or 4 newspapers or 3 or 4 radio stations or television channels. They're going to lots of different places, and the challenge is to walk into those many thousands of rooms and understand the conversations that are being had, and to reach out to people in spaces and through language that they understand.
So while, of course, the reaching is a technical issue, it's more of a money issue too, from what I remember and read about, is that BJP in its head office has like an entire 4-floored building with computers and people just sitting there and doing this from morning till evening. And that requires a sort of money and manpower that the opposition probably will not have. So is that to say that without this sort of money and power today, there's no underdog there who can kind of come out and use nationalism to build a better democracy?
Look, I mean, the BJP is a very extreme case of a high level of organizational development. But let's take Hungary as it was a case where there was domination of the kind of legacy media, traditional media, by the incumbent government. And then there was, the digital space was a little more fragmented. And it's always possible for opposition to come up and use its kind of know-how to mount a challenge to existing power structures. And we just saw that happen very successfully in Hungary without access to the money that came from government advertising revenues and such like. So it's eminently possible. What it requires is a group of really committed people who are going to organize and organize for the long term, because the battle might not be won in this next election or the election after that, but the organization takes a long time to build up. The BJP's base, the RSS, and generally the Sangh Parivar, the family of Hindu organizations, they weren't built overnight. They've been built over a period of almost 100 years. And that infrastructure is now coming to bear on an age of social media. But for those people who are willing to put in the time to organize effectively, there's always space for a challenge.
So in India, what we're seeing recently is quite funny. So the Chief Justice of India goes on record and in one of the cases calls the youth of our country unemployed and say that they are like cockroaches. And then we see this uproar on social media the very next day using AI images from ChatGPT and calls it the Cockroach Janata Party. Yes. And while that was just a social media fad, a lot of people thought, now the founder of the party comes to New Delhi and they managed to organize a protest against everything that systematically is wrong with the country, including unemployment, NEET examinations, and 6,000 to 7,000 youth show up and had a peaceful protest. Do you think that this is a moment where nationalism's meaning is changing in a country like India?
Yes.
Or is it too soon to say?
Yeah,
I would hope.
Yeah, so it's such an interesting example, because one of the things that I see from the Cockroach Janta movement is that it is trying to redefine citizenship. So in that way, it is, I think, a really interesting and exciting example of youth activism, because we need youth to come out and to be politically engaged. And India has a tremendous unemployment problem, and the ability to organize quickly like it has, and to set up an Instagram account that I believe now has more followers than the BJP does.
Almost 7 million extra.
And it is, that's an extraordinary achievement, but that should not be taken as a sign of success per se, right? Because we all have seen fires that burn very brightly, but then combust and move out. The real work is to build up a movement of, for what does this movement stand for? So it's all well and fine to admire the problem and to say the problem is youth unemployment. The problem is a whole litany of issues that youth, I think, rightly are engaging in. But what's the solution? And it's important to move soon for this party. It will be important to move away from just, embracing this kind of this cockroach persona in defiance of the establishment, to what do they actually stand for? What are the policies that this party is going to engage with and promote? And those are where, that is the arena where we're going to look to whether it will be able to define and redefine Indian nationalism. The fact that it's so unbelievably large so quickly is exciting and organic, but it's very hard to have a sustained, leaderless, organic movement. With time, every movement needs to organize, and that means hierarchy, and that means leadership. And make no mistake about it, the BJP is pushing back very hard. I mean, I heard from an example of somebody who went to one of those protests, and one of their social media, their mobile network was shut off because they got a message from their phone company that they noticed unusual activity. You know, in India, it leads the world right now in internet shutdowns. The BJP is going to try very, very hard to quash this movement. So the challenge to this group is, does it have what it takes to organize to survive?
The movement takes me back to the late 2010s, which is that with the Anna Hazare corruption movement. But that had the sense of righteousness attached to it. And a lot of people believed in it, and that led to the Aathma Party being formed and then going on to winning the Delhi elections. Do you see a similar movement for CJP here, or is it, again, too soon to say?
It's very early to tell, but the way in which it's similar is that, I mean, I think a lot of youth, I mean, you yourself are a member of the Indian youth, so maybe you should be answering this question. But I think that there's a sense that the older generation doesn't really understand the plight of the younger generation, right? And that there is a preaching from a perspective of an economy and a stability that is no longer available to the young youth who are joining the labor market. And there's a real sense in which the Chief Justice calling the youth cockroaches and the youth taking that identity and using social media to throw that back in their faces is absolutely resonating. And I think it captures something of a sense that, you know, we are working hard, we are trying, but there aren't jobs, and we don't have the same support networks that our parents had, and women are less inclined to have children in the same way. The Economist actually reported on that this week, that India's fertility is literally off of a cliff on the other side, especially in areas like Delhi and Mumbai, and that there's just a lot of change. And the older generations, they didn't have to get a job in this world, and they didn't have to think about creating a family in this world. And so the younger generation knows the challenges it's up against, and it knows that the older generation doesn't understand it. Whether it translates that into, though, as Anna Hazare did, a movement, a party that is going to run for elections, that is what remains to be seen.
I am so excited about it, though.
The one additional thing I would say is that it's so easy to put nationalism in a category of an identity that is hugely problematic because it has been historically. But if you look at the countries out there that don't have a strong and developed national identity, countries like Yemen or Ethiopia, that lack of a national identity has been a huge problem. So while it's a struggle to create a national identity that powers collective action, make no mistake about it, if you don't have a national identity, you're in an area where the polity and the society that you're in is going to struggle more.
So for a leader tomorrow who is using the thick, inclusive nationalism, are there certain guardrails that they can create around this identity for the future generations to come to kind of not use it against for bad, exclusive means?
Look, all identities can be the basis of exclusion. Every single one. And that is the basis of social psychology, that all in-groups tend to be motivated, or most tend to be motivated more by a sense of communal solidarity than they are by othering the out-group. But there's always an out-group. And make no mistake about it, there's nothing one can do to any identity to prevent it from being weaponized. But that doesn't mean that identity isn't meaningful, and the identity of the nation is a battery for powering all kinds of important projects. So if you think about the most important political challenges of our time, climate change, inequality. Nationalism is a resource that can be used for generating collective action to solve those problems.
Thank you, Maya, so much for helping us understand about nationalism and what drives nationalism. Any other advice that you need to tell us for the future generations who you want them to use thick, inclusive nationalism?
I would just say, you said you're enthusiastic about this new movement. Harness your enthusiasm. Go out there and find the problems that you think need to be addressed. You can't choose every battle, but choose one. And then, put your nose to the ground for the long-term, slow and steady work of constructing a movement that is going to change that.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.